Which? You don't belong here. My daughter-in-law's voice rang out across the restaurant, sharp enough that every conversation around us seemed to stop at once. And in that strange, suspended silence, I realized something far more unsettling than the words themselves. I realized she wanted everyone to hear it. The soft clink of silverware faded. A waiter froze mid-step beside a table just a few feet away, and I sat there, staring down at the plate in front of me, as if it could somehow anchor me to the moment before everything shifted. It had been a simple dinner, or at least that's what I had believed when I drove the 20 miles from my quiet suburban home into the city, dressed in the navy blouse my late husband once said made me look elegant, not old. Hoping, perhaps foolishly, that tonight might feel like family again. The restaurant was one of those upscale places with low lighting and polished wood, the kind where people celebrate promotions and anniversaries, and when I arrived, I saw my son Daniel already seated with his wife Jessica, her posture perfectly straight, her smile thin and practiced, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Mom, you made it," Daniel had said, standing halfway as if unsure whether to fully commit to the gesture, and I hugged him anyway, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, trying to ignore the faint tension in his shoulders. Jessica had offered a brief greeting, her voice polite but distant, and I told myself not to read into it. Not tonight. Not when I had spent the entire afternoon wrapping a small gift for them. Something thoughtful, something I hoped might remind them that I was still part of their lives. We ordered dinner, exchanged small talk about traffic and work schedules, and for a few fleeting minutes, I allowed myself to believe the unease I'd been feeling for months was just in my head, that perhaps I had been imagining the subtle exclusions, the missed invitations, the way conversations seemed to stop when I entered a room. But then, somewhere between the main course and dessert, the air shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, like the moment before a storm when everything grows too still. Jessica set her fork down with a deliberate motion, the faintest smile curling at the corner of her lips, and when she looked at me, there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite place. Not anger, not even irritation, but something colder, something calculated. I remember thinking, in that split second, that whatever came next had already been decided long before we sat down at that table. And then it happened, her voice cutting clean through the room, loud enough to draw every gaze, every whispered curiosity, every silent judgment. And I felt it not just in my ears but in my chest, like a door slamming shut somewhere deep inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look at her right away. Instead, I straightened slightly in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of her words to settle over the table. Across from me, Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering between his wife and the surface of the table as if searching for somewhere safe to land. But he said nothing, not a single word to correct her, not even my name. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who suddenly knew something about me that wasn't true, I understood that this wasn't about a misunderstanding or a bad evening or even a cruel remark spoken in frustration. This was intentional, deliberate, and carefully placed, like a move in a game I hadn't realized we were playing. I let out a slow breath, the kind you take when you're about to step into cold water, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to meet Jessica's gaze directly. She held it, unflinching, almost expectant, as if waiting for me to react, to defend myself, to give her exactly the scene she had set the stage for. But I didn't give her that. I simply offered a small, measured smile, the kind that reveals nothing, and lowered my eyes back to the table, because right then, in that quiet, controlled moment, I realized something she clearly hadn't considered, that sometimes the person who says the least is the one who understands the most, and whatever she thought she had accomplished with that single sentence, she had just made a mistake she couldn't take back. I became aware of the room again in fragments, like someone slowly turning the lights back on after a storm had passed, the low hum of conversations returning in cautious waves, the faint clinking of glasses resuming as though nothing unusual had happened, even though I could still feel the weight of dozens of eyes lingering just a little too long before politely looking away. The waiter who had been standing nearby approached our table with careful steps, his expression neutral, but his voice softer than before as he asked if everything was all right, and before I could answer, Jessica gave a light, dismissive laugh and waved her hand as if brushing away something insignificant, saying it was just a misunderstanding, just a family moment. Her tone smooth and practiced in a way that told me she had already moved on from what she had done. I noticed how quickly she reclaimed control of the narrative, how easily she folded the moment into something small and harmless. And I realized that to her, this was not a mistake or an outburst. It was simply another step in something she had been building for a long time. Daniel finally cleared his throat, shifting in his chair as he reached for his glass of water, taking a sip he did not seem to need, his eyes still refusing to meet mine. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost careful, as if he were choosing each word to avoid creating more discomfort. "Mom, maybe we should just let it go for tonight," he said. And there it was, not an apology, not even a question, just a suggestion that I should accept what had happened and move past it as though it were nothing more than an awkward misunderstanding. I studied his face then, really looked at him in a way I had not allowed myself to for months, noticing the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders angled slightly toward Jessica rather than toward me, and I felt a strange clarity settle over me, the kind that comes not with anger, but with recognition. This was not the son who used to call me every Sunday, who used to ask for my advice, who used to sit at my kitchen table long after dinner just to talk. This was someone who had already chosen where he stood, even if he did not have the courage to say it out loud. I nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and reached for my purse, the leather worn soft from years of use, pulling out my wallet with steady hands as I placed enough cash on the table to cover my meal and more, the bills lying neatly beside the untouched plate in front of me, a quiet statement that I would not owe anything to this moment, not even the price of dinner. Jessica watched me with a faint smile, her eyes sharp with curiosity, as if she were waiting to see whether I would finally react, whether I would raise my voice or challenge her in front of everyone. But I did neither. I simply stood up, smoothing my blouse as I did, and for a brief second, I caught my reflection in the darkened window beside our table, the soft glow of the restaurant lights outlining a woman who looked composed, even calm, but whose eyes held something new, something that had not been there when I walked in. I turned slightly toward Daniel, giving him a small nod that carried more meaning than words could have, and then I stepped away from the table, the sound of my heels against the polished floor, steady and unhurried as I made my way toward the exit. No one stopped me, no one called my name, and the further I moved from that table, the lighter the air seemed to feel, as though I were leaving behind something heavier than just a conversation gone wrong. When I pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the cool night air, I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, the city lights stretching out in front of me, cars passing by in a steady rhythm, and I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs completely before releasing it just as slowly. It would have been easy to feel hurt, to replay every word and every glance, to wonder what I could have done differently. But instead, I found myself thinking about something else entirely, something quieter but far more important, and as I reached into my purse for my phone, my fingers brushing against the edge of a folded document I had placed there earlier that week, I realized that tonight had not taken anything from me. If anything, it had finally shown me exactly what I needed to see. The night air carried a quiet kind of clarity as I stood there on the sidewalk, the sounds of the city steady and indifferent, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something settle inside me that was not confusion or hurt, but certainty. I walked slowly toward my car parked a short distance down the block, my heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step measured, deliberate, as though I were leaving more behind than just a restaurant. When I reached the driver's seat, I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead at the reflection of streetlights stretching across the windshield, and I allowed myself to think, not about what had just happened, but about everything that had led to it, because moments like that do not appear out of nowhere. They build quietly over time, in small dismissals, in conversations that exclude you, in decisions made without your voice. And as I sat there, I began to see those moments more clearly than I ever had before. I remembered the first time Jessica had corrected me in front of guests, her tone light, but her words sharp enough to make me pause, and how Daniel had laughed it off, telling me I was being sensitive. I remembered holidays that slowly shifted away from my home to hers, the invitations that became shorter, less frequent, until they were no longer invitations at all, but information given after plans had already been made. I remembered standing in my own kitchen months ago, listening as Jessica explained to Daniel that it might be easier if I did not come to certain gatherings because I would feel out of place, and how he had agreed with a quiet nod, as if that decision did not involve me at all. At the time, I had told myself it was nothing, that families change, that roles shift, that I needed to adapt. But sitting there in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I understood that those moments were not accidents. They were steps, carefully placed, leading exactly to where I had found myself tonight. My hand moved almost unconsciously to my purse, and I pulled out the folded document I had tucked inside earlier that week. The paper slightly creased from being handled, but still crisp enough to remind me of its significance. I unfolded it slowly, the soft rustle filling the quiet space of the car, and my eyes scanned the lines I already knew by heart. The formal language outlining decisions that had taken me months to make. Decisions I had once hesitated over because I believed there was still something to preserve, something to protect. But now, that hesitation felt distant, almost unnecessary, as if it belonged to a version of me who had not yet seen the full picture. I thought about Daniel, about the boy he used to be, about the man he had become, and I realized that holding on to who he once was had kept me from seeing who he is now. And that realization did not come with anger, but with a quiet acceptance that felt heavier and yet somehow freeing at the same time. I folded the document carefully and placed it back into my purse, my movements calm, precise, as if each action carried a purpose that extended beyond this moment. Then I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had saved but not yet used, my thumb hovering over the screen for just a second before I pressed call. The line rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered, steady and professional, and when I spoke, my tone matched that same calm. "Hello, this is Margaret Collins," I said, my voice even, unwavering. "I believe it is time we move forward with everything we discussed." And as the conversation continued, outlining next steps, confirming details, setting things into motion, I felt a quiet shift within me, not dramatic, not sudden, but firm, like something finally settling into place after being uncertain for far too long. When I ended the call, I placed the phone gently on the passenger seat and finally started the engine, the soft hum filling the car as I pulled out into the flow of traffic, the city lights guiding the road ahead. And for the first time that evening, I did not look back. The drive home felt longer than usual. Even though the distance had not changed, the familiar streets passing by in a steady rhythm as the city gradually gave way to quieter neighborhoods. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light I had left on earlier cast a soft, welcoming glow against the front of the house, the same house I had lived in for over 30 years, the same house where Daniel had taken his first steps, where every corner held a memory that once felt unshakable. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence settle around me. A different kind of silence than the one in the restaurant. This one calm, steady, almost protective. And when I finally stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door, I felt a quiet awareness that I was not stepping back into the same space I had left just a few hours earlier, because something inside me had changed. The key turned easily in the lock, the soft click echoing faintly in the entryway as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Greeted by the familiar scent of polished wood and lavender from the diffuser I kept near the hallway table, and for a moment, I simply stood there, taking it in, the framed photographs along the wall, the neatly arranged furniture, the small details that spoke of a life carefully built over decades. I walked into the living room and set my purse down on the coffee table, my eyes drifting to the photograph on the mantel, the one of Daniel at 12 years old, standing beside his father with a wide, unguarded smile, and I felt that same quiet clarity return, not painful, not sharp, but steady, like a truth that no longer needed to be questioned. I moved through the house slowly, turning on a lamp here, adjusting a chair there, small actions that grounded me in the present, until I found myself in the kitchen, where I filled a glass with water and stood by the window, looking out at the backyard where the trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their shadows stretching across the grass. It was in that stillness that the weight of the past began to settle into something more defined, not a collection of scattered moments, but a pattern that I could now see clearly from beginning to end, and I realized that for years, I had been trying to preserve something that no longer existed, holding on to an idea of family that had quietly shifted without my consent. I set the glass down on the counter and reached for my purse again, pulling out the document once more, this time placing it flat on the kitchen table, smoothing it out with the palm of my hand as if to confirm its presence, its reality. The words on the page were precise, formal, and final, outlining decisions that would change the course of everything that followed, decisions that I had once thought I might never have the strength to make. But now, standing there in my own home, I understood that strength had never been the issue. It had simply been a matter of timing, of seeing clearly enough to act without hesitation. I pulled out a chair and sat down, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room as I reached for a pen from the drawer beside me, turning it slowly between my fingers, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to think about what this would mean, not just for me, but for Daniel, for the version of our relationship that would no longer continue as it had before. But even that thought did not bring doubt, only a sense of inevitability, as if this moment had been approaching for a long time and was now finally here. I placed the pen on the table beside the document and leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze steady, my breathing even, and I realized that tonight had not been about humiliation or rejection, not in the way it might have seemed on the surface. It had been something else entirely, something quieter but far more decisive, because in trying to push me out, they had given me the one thing I had been missing all along, and that was clarity. I sat there for a long time with the document in front of me, the pen resting just inches away, yet I did not rush to pick it up, because for the first time in years, I did not feel pressured to react, to fix something, or to smooth things over the way I always had. Instead, I let the silence of the house settle around me, steady and unbroken, and in that quiet, I allowed myself to fully understand what had changed, not just tonight, but over the course of many years that I had chosen not to examine too closely. I thought about all the times I had adjusted my plans to fit theirs, the dinners I had rescheduled, the holidays I had simplified, the invitations I had accepted even when they came at the last minute and carried an unspoken message that I was an afterthought rather than a priority. And I realized that each of those moments had slowly rewritten my place in the family without me ever agreeing to it. I had told myself it was love, that it was patience, that it was what a mother does, but sitting there now, I saw it for what it truly was, a quiet erosion of boundaries that I had allowed because I believed that holding on was better than letting go. My gaze drifted again to the photograph on the mantel, visible from where I sat. Daniel's younger face frozen in a moment of uncomplicated happiness, and I felt a brief, familiar ache, not sharp enough to break me, but present enough to remind me of what had once been real. However, that feeling did not pull me backward the way it used to. It simply existed alongside everything else I now understood, and for the first time, I did not try to resolve the contradiction. I accepted it. I reached for the pen then, turning it slowly between my fingers, feeling the weight of it, the simplicity of the action it represented, and I placed it down again, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because this decision was not about urgency, it was about certainty. I stood up from the table and walked into the hallway, pausing in front of the small cabinet where I kept a set of keys, and I opened the drawer, taking out a second set I had not used in years, the spare keys I had once given Daniel when he first moved out, the ones I had kept just in case he ever needed them again. I held them in my hand for a moment, the metal cool against my palm, and I realized how symbolic they had become, not just of access to a house, but of access to my life, my time, my energy, all the things I had given so freely without ever asking whether they were still valued. I closed my fingers around them and walked back into the kitchen, placing the keys gently beside the document on the table, aligning them neatly as if they were part of the same decision, because in many ways, they were. The house around me remained still, unchanged, yet it felt different now, not because anything physical had shifted, but because I was no longer seeing it through the same lens. I was no longer measuring its worth by who came and went, by who chose to be present or absent. It simply was mine, and that realization carried a quiet strength that I had not fully acknowledged before. I returned to my chair and sat down again. My posture relaxed but deliberate, and I finally picked up the pen, not with hesitation, but with a calm understanding that this moment was not the end of something, but the beginning of a different kind of life, one where I would no longer wait to be included, no longer accept being diminished in small, polite ways that added up over time. And as I signed my name at the bottom of the page, the ink flowing smoothly across the paper, I did not feel anger or regret. I felt something much simpler and much more powerful. I felt done. The ink had barely dried when I set the pen down, and for a moment, I simply looked at my name at the bottom of the page, written in the same careful script I had used for decades. Yet this time it felt different, not because the signature had changed, but because the meaning behind it had. I gathered the document and the spare keys together, aligning them neatly before placing them back into my purse. My movements steady and deliberate, as if each small action carried its own quiet confirmation that I was no longer hesitating. The house remained still around me, the soft hum of appliances and the distant ticking of the clock in the hallway marking time in a way that felt almost reassuring. And I realized that this space, which had once felt tied so closely to the presence of others, now stood on its own, unchanged, and yet somehow more certain. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the living room, pausing briefly at the mantel, my fingers brushing lightly against the frame of the photograph before I moved on, not out of avoidance, but out of acceptance, because I no longer needed to linger there to remind myself of what had been. Upstairs, I changed into something more comfortable, folding my blouse neatly and placing it over the back of a chair, a small, ordinary action that grounded me in the present. And when I returned downstairs, I poured myself a cup of tea, the warmth of the mug settling into my hands as I sat by the window once more, looking out at the quiet street. I did not replay the evening, did not revisit the words or the looks or the silence that had followed, because I already understood them. And understanding had replaced the need to question. Instead, I thought about what would come next, not in terms of confrontation or explanation, but in terms of action, the kind that does not require an audience, the kind that unfolds quietly but changes everything. The following morning arrived with a soft, pale light filtering through the curtains, and I woke earlier than usual, not from restlessness, but from a sense of purpose that had settled in overnight. I dressed simply, choosing a neutral outfit that felt both familiar and composed, and after a light breakfast, I gathered my purse and checked once more that everything I needed was inside. The document, the keys, my phone, all of it accounted for. The drive across town was calm, the traffic light, the sky clear, and when I pulled into the parking lot of the office building, I noticed how ordinary everything looked, how nothing in the outside world reflected the significance of what I was about to do. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, the glass doors opening automatically as I approached, the cool air of the lobby greeting me as I stepped inside. The receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile, asking how she could help, and I returned the gesture with the same calm expression I had carried with me since the night before, giving my name and explaining that I had an appointment. As I waited, seated in a chair near the window, I watched people move in and out of the building, each of them focused on their own concerns, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in my life, and I found that I did not need them to be aware, because this was not about being seen or understood by others. It was about finally acting on something I had known for a long time. When my name was called, I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and followed the assistant down the hallway, each step steady, each breath even. And as I entered the office, I knew without any doubt that what I was about to set into motion would not be undone. I stepped into the office and was greeted by a quiet, professional space that smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the kind of place where decisions were made without raised voices or dramatic gestures. And that alone felt fitting for what I had come to do. The man who stood to greet me extended his hand with a polite smile, his demeanor calm and measured as he introduced himself again, though we had already spoken on the phone. And I appreciated that about him, the consistency, the lack of unnecessary emotion, because it mirrored exactly how I felt. I took a seat across from his desk, placing my purse carefully beside me before removing the document and the set of keys, setting them on the polished surface between us, not with hesitation, but with quiet intention. He glanced at the items briefly before looking back at me, his expression attentive but neutral, and he asked a simple question, whether I was certain I wanted to proceed, and I noticed that he did not rush me, did not fill the silence that followed. He simply waited. I nodded once, a small, steady movement that carried more weight than any explanation could have, and I told him that I was not here because of a single evening or a single conversation. I was here because of a pattern I could no longer ignore, and as I spoke, my voice remained even, not cold, not emotional, just clear. He listened carefully, making a few notes, asking only what was necessary, and together we went through each detail, each clause, each decision that would now become final, the language precise, the implications understood without needing to be repeated. There was something almost grounding about the process, the way everything was laid out in clear terms, nothing implied, nothing left to interpretation, and I realized how different that was from the unspoken expectations I had been navigating for years. At one point, he paused and looked at me directly, explaining what would happen next, how the documents would be filed, how the notifications would be delivered, how certain access would be changed and certain assumptions would no longer hold. And I listened without interruption, taking in each step not as a loss, but as a realignment. When it was time, he turned the document toward me, indicating where I needed to sign again, and I picked up the pen without hesitation, placing my signature exactly where it belonged, the motion smooth, practiced, final. He collected the pages, organizing them neatly before placing them into a folder, and as he did, he mentioned that once everything was processed, there would be no reversal without significant effort, and I found myself almost appreciating that detail, because it confirmed what I already knew, that this was not something I intended to undo. When the meeting concluded, he stood and thanked me, his tone respectful, and I gathered my belongings, slipping the now lighter contents back into my purse, the absence of the document noticeable but not unsettling. As I walked back through the hallway and into the lobby, I noticed the same quiet movement of people going about their day, and I felt a subtle shift within myself. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a steady sense that something had been set into motion that would not require further explanation. Outside, the sunlight had grown stronger, casting sharp, clear shadows across the pavement, and as I made my way to my car, I took a slow breath, letting the air fill my lungs before releasing it just as steadily. I knew that soon, conversations would happen, questions would be asked, reactions would come, but none of that felt urgent anymore, because for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting to respond to someone else's choices. I had made my own, and that made all the difference. I drove home without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle naturally around me as the road stretched ahead in a steady line. The morning light now fully awake, casting a clarity over everything that felt almost symbolic, as if the world itself had decided to remove any shadows I might have once hidden behind. When I pulled into my driveway, I did not pause this time. I stepped out of the car immediately, closing the door with a soft but definite sound, and walked toward the house with a sense of direction that had not been there the day before. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, the same arrangement, the same stillness, but I no longer saw it as something fragile or temporary. It felt grounded, self-contained, no longer waiting for anyone to complete it. I set my purse down on the entry table and moved through the house with quiet purpose, opening drawers, organizing small things that had been left untouched for too long, not out of necessity, but because it felt like the right moment to reclaim the space in ways I had postponed. By mid-morning, I made myself a simple lunch, something I had not done with intention in quite some time, and I sat at the kitchen table alone, not with a sense of absence, but with a calm awareness that being alone was not the same as being excluded. My phone rested beside me, silent, and I noticed that I was not checking it, not anticipating a message, not wondering whether someone would reach out, because I already knew what would come, and more importantly, I knew that I was no longer waiting for it. It was early afternoon when the first call came, the screen lighting up with Daniel's name, and I looked at it for a moment, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet observation, as if I were seeing something familiar from a new distance. I let it ring, the sound steady and consistent until it stopped on its own, and a few seconds later, A message notification appeared, followed by another, the pattern predictable, almost rehearsed. I did not open them right away. Instead, I stood up, walked to the living room, and adjusted one of the frames on the shelf, aligning it perfectly with the others, a small action that felt more meaningful than it should have, because it reflected something internal that had shifted into place. When I finally returned to the table, I picked up the phone and read the messages. Daniel asking if I had made it home safely, his tone careful, then more direct, asking what had happened, why I had left so abruptly, and beneath the words, I could sense the confusion, the discomfort, perhaps even a hint of concern, but what I did not see was understanding. Not yet. I set the phone down again without responding, not out of avoidance, but because I understood that this was not a conversation that needed to happen immediately, or perhaps not in the way it had always happened before. Later in the afternoon, another message came, this time from Jessica, shorter, more direct, her words framed as an apology, but lacking the weight of acknowledgement, as if the purpose was not to take responsibility, but to restore the appearance of normalcy as quickly as possible. I read it once, then set the phone aside again. The silence that followed no longer heavy, but settled, intentional. Outside, the light began to soften as the day moved toward evening, and I found myself standing by the window once more, looking out at the quiet street. The same view I had seen countless times before, yet it felt different now, not because anything had changed outside, but because I was no longer standing there waiting for something to return to the way it was. Whatever came next would not be a continuation of what had been. It would be something else entirely, something defined not by their expectations, but by my own decisions, and for the first time in a long time, that thought did not feel uncertain, it felt right. The evening settled in quietly, the soft glow of the lamps casting familiar shadows across the walls as I moved through the house with an ease that felt new, not because the space had changed, but because my place within it finally had. I prepared a simple dinner, nothing elaborate, just enough to fill the room with a sense of routine, and as I sat down at the table, I noticed something I had not allowed myself to acknowledge before. The absence of tension, the absence of waiting, the absence of that subtle feeling that I needed to adjust myself to fit someone else's expectations. My phone remained on the counter, face down, and when it vibrated again, I did not rush to it. I finished my meal, cleared my plate, rinsed it in the sink, each movement steady, intentional, as if reclaiming something that had been quietly taken from me over time. When I finally picked up the phone, there were more messages. Daniel's words now more urgent, asking why I was not responding, asking if something was wrong. And Jessica's tone had shifted as well, her messages more controlled, more careful, as if she were trying to rewrite the tone of what had happened the night before, but the meaning remained the same, and I saw it clearly now, without the need to interpret or excuse it. I set the phone down again, not with frustration, but with a sense of finality, because I understood that whatever explanation they expected would not change what had already been set into motion. The following day arrived with the same quiet clarity, and by mid-morning, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine idling for a moment before turning off, followed by the faint closing of a door, and I knew without looking who it was. I did not rush to the window, did not feel the need to prepare myself. I simply continued what I was doing, folding a stack of freshly laundered towels with the same care I gave to everything else now. A moment later, the doorbell rang, the sound clear and steady, and I walked toward the front door at an unhurried pace, my hand resting briefly on the handle before I opened it. Daniel stood there, his expression tense, his posture uncertain, and behind him, a few steps back, Jessica remained near the car, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed in a way that suggested she was already assessing the situation rather than stepping into it. For a brief second, none of us spoke, the space between us filled with everything that had been left unsaid, and then Daniel began, his voice carrying a mix of concern and confusion, asking what was going on, why I had not answered, why I had left the way I did. I listened, without interrupting, my expression calm, my stance steady, and when he finished, I stepped slightly aside, opening the door wider, not as an invitation, but as a gesture of clarity, and I told him, in a voice that was even and measured, that there was nothing to discuss in the way he expected, that some things had already been decided, not in anger, not in reaction, but with time and understanding. He looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to find the version of me he was used to, the one who would explain, who would soften the edges, who would make things easier for everyone else. But that version was no longer standing in front of him, and I could see the moment that realization began to settle in. Jessica shifted slightly in the background, her confidence less certain now, her expression harder to read, and for the first time, she did not step forward, she did not take control of the conversation, she simply watched. I held Daniel's gaze for a moment longer before stepping back, not to retreat, but to create distance, and I told him that whatever came next would not be negotiated at the dinner table or explained in passing. It would unfold in its own time, through the decisions that had already been made. And as I closed the door gently but firmly, the sound of it settling into place felt less like an ending and more like a boundary that should have been there all along.